So two responses. One is, as we can see, I think Ryan Coogler was behind Judas and the Black Messiah. When you have people of color behind the scenes, they can tell the real story. So that's one thing I want to point out. But I'm also really kind of dysregulated right now as I think about what we talked about not too long ago, about the lynchings and watching the videos. And all that comes up for me is two things. One is Emmett Till's mom said, let them see what they did to my boy. And you would hope that it would have brought so much shame that, you know, you would see a change, but obviously we're still watching videos of people being killed and slammed on the street. But then I think about Baldwin, who says, these are a reflection of you. Look at yourself. You are depraved. Not all white people, but white supremacists. And I just find myself thinking, you still haven't seen it? After all these years, when you think about watching the things on Facebook and everything, I stopped. Tamir Rice, I was traumatized after watching that video, and I did allow myself to watch Assembly Bowls, but after that I committed to not doing that anymore. Because it is, you shouldn't have to be, when you see a police officer nearby, you should not be responding. We already have trauma that's been passed down. Well, I'm a child of Nigerian immigrants, so I'm understanding more about the epidemic of trauma that has passed through descendants of slaves. So that's a real thing, so why continue to do that to ourselves? But I think one thing to consider is, what does it say about the majority, that they can see these things and still not feel anything? And I don't have an answer, but that's what comes up for me.
Thank you. And along those same lines, what lessons are we not learning, or maybe what are our biggest or worst myths that we continue to tell, either publicly or within or among ourselves?
Going back to Green Book, you're like, this guy has a real beef with Green Book. Raise your hand if you've read the text of a critical race theory ban. The laws that are being passed to limit critical race theory, raise your hand high if you've read the actual words. Okay, you can put your hands down. In general, in 12 states, they've passed these critical race theory bans that punish educators for talking to students about white supremacy. Specifically, they all have a decoy clause that begins with, they define these, they don't even call it critical race theory, they call it divisive concepts, which sounds like we're in some weird Hunger Games world. But they have a decoy clause, always number one, which is you can't tell kids that one race is superior to any others. I don't know any teachers who are doing that, but it's a clause they hide behind because then they can do other crazy reprehensible stuff. And then when you're like, hey, it's pretty crazy that we can't teach kids that, they're like, I'm just talking about supremacy. And then the other ones, the main ones are teachers, the divisive concepts are you cannot tell kids that implicit bias exists. You cannot tell kids that structural racism exists. You cannot tell kids that America was fundamentally or irredeemably racist. What you call a country where all the first presidents owned slaves and specifically wrote its constitution to ensure that if a slave escapes, we'll bring him back. I don't know what you call that if not fundamentally racist, right? They even go hard on meritocracy. You cannot talk about meritocracy as a tool for racism or sexism, right? And then the big clause that all of them have is you cannot teach a student anything that makes them feel guilt, shame, or discomfort. I don't know how you're teaching anything in class. It's like, what? If you are black, the history of our people is shame and discomfort in this country, right? Because these bills assume that the normative child whose story gets told is white. And what these bills are doing are they are restructuring all of our 14th Amendment language that we drafted around protecting people against racial harms. And they're saying, yes, we're adding a new category. Talking about race is a racial harm to white children. So in Tennessee, if they watch my film, I hope you come and watch it tonight at 6:30, but if we were to show this in a Tennessee classroom, and that teacher was reported to the Board of Ed, that teacher could lose their job, and the school could be fined up to $5 million of per pupil funding. I'll back up. We have a system with 12 laws on books now bills proposed in 24 states at least across the country, right? More on the way, that say that if you teach black kids about their own history that is so potentially harmful to white kids, that we will remove the teachers and we will remove the little bit of funding that public schools have, and this will only work in the public system. Kim Crenshaw, I was like, hey, is this the next Brown v. Board? She's like, no, this is the next Plessy versus Ferguson. This is a dual system, right? So that is just to say that is our foundational racial myth right now. If we were living in 1860, the racial logic would have been black people are not people. The foundational myth right now is talking about racism causes racism. So back to this Green Book thing, when you are making a film, when you're funding a, sorry, Siri is government surveillance. Stop making it about race. If the North Dakota's CRT bill just cuts all through it, has one page, and it says you're not allowed to teach critical race theory, and we will define critical race theory as the theory that racism exists outside of individual bias. Just such beautiful, devious brevity. You cannot teach in this entire state, you cannot teach any children of any color that there's any racism outside of individuals hating each other. So that is just to say that if that is the myth, why would we tell any other story in films, in our classes? Why would we contribute to this idea that the problem of race is between individuals, when it is literally what they are outlawing us to be able to talk about state by state?
I think I have a pessimistic view on this topic, but I would love to hear everybody else's perspective about it. But I think what I've learned thus far is that history repeats itself, and slavery hasn't changed, it just looks different, right? You think about the prison pipeline, the different systems that are in place that have just changed but produce the same outcome that keeps one on top and then one below. And I think we understand, that the majority is the problem, but it's like, what's next? And I came across a piece, the James Baldwin piece, how much time does it take? And I'm still stuck there because that's what I want to know, like from this point moving forward, we understand the problem, we understand the issues, and even when we do give resources to minorities or black folk, it's destroyed. You look at Black Wall Street, right? And then you go back to Malcolm X and his talk with the white liberal. There's so much context of this cycle that we go in our country, and the outcome is always the same. And for me, is what is the next move? What is the different move? Because right now we're still in that same cycle.
I'll be quick. For me, the myth that I've been sort of wrestling with is the idea that you don't know. I tend to be very like, oh, maybe they didn't see it, but over the years I'm like, no, you see it. You see it. You don't want to see it, or it makes you uncomfortable. So again, psychology, cognitive dissonance, you're trying to mitigate how uncomfortable it makes you feel. It makes you feel. And so for me, the myth is that white people don't see it. I think white people do see it. They just need some facilitation to engage with it, but for the most part, it's obvious, I think.
One of the myths that I deal with in my classroom and with my students is this notion of the narrative of African American history and the idea of progress, right? When we think about that standard list of that long line of esteemed Negroes who we read about and sing about during February, right? So it's Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, W.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, I'm gonna put up all their names out there, right? You can put Mary Cloud King, but when you look at them, and it's I'm don't forget to put Martin Luther King Jr. up there, gotta put Rosa Parks up there, and of course we gotta end it out with Barack Obama, right? And so when you do that, what emerges when you sit back and you look is this narrative of docility, right? This narrative of non-resistance, of this narrative of cooperation, of patience, right? This narrative of waiting for you'll have heavenly rewards and not your earthly rewards. Bump that, I need to pay my rent now, right? thank you, Lord, but I like to eat. I like to eat meat, right? And so I have this conversation with my students about changing the narrative of what African American history is, right? So what would it look like for students if instead of teaching that narrative of docility and cooperation, that we taught about like Ida B. Wells? What if we taught about Martin Delany? What if we taught about David Walker? What if we talked about Henry Highland Garnett, let your motto be resistance? What if we talked about, all of the black folks who said, hell no, not anymore. Take that weapon from him, knock him upside his head. What if we taught students, Ida B. Wells back in the late 19th century was saying, a Winchester rifle should occupy a place of honor in every Negro home. Because when they come for you, you better take three of them with you. Like, imagine. Like, so I struggle with that, right? That's one of the things that I struggle with, this narrative of what African American history is supposed to be. And then I also struggle with the notion of progress. Like, I ask students this and they get really quiet, and then they give you the answer that they've been taught to give, which is, well, there's a lot of progress, right? Because we had a black president, and we've done this, we've done that. And well, you know that, but here's the thing. The litmus test for a society should not be, well, there are no mob lynchings. Like, if that's our starting point, like, well, black men, women, and children aren't being beaten, raped, generally, having their genitals mutilated and then being killed, so that's progress, right? Absolutely not. We can still watch Sam DeVos being murdered online. We can still see, Trayvon Martin. We can still see Tamir Rice playing with a gun, a toy gun. Like, that's not progress. That's not progress. That's just us attempting to intellectualize all the things that are fundamentally wrong with this nation. And when you were saying this earlier, I have to say, I'm fully expecting to get fired at some point. 100%. Like, if Senate Bill 322 or 327 comes along, I don't have a job. I make a career out of talking about uncomfortable things, teaching race. That's a myth. That's a myth, that to talk about race is divisive. It is the duty of every sovereign citizen in this nation. We live, supposedly, in a civil society. It's your duty to talk about these things. It's our duty to understand our history. And to say that we're not going to teach it because it makes somebody uncomfortable, there's no growth in the comfort zone, there's no comfort in the growth zone. It's time for us to get to the real work. The real work.
Thank you. Gerald, you talked a little bit about pessimism, and Dr. McGee, you're mentioning this idea of progress. And my next question would be: do you see progress as inevitable, or the common refrain a lot of us have heard over our lives is this idea that we shall overcome? And I guess my question is: will we? Shall we? Is this conversation the end goal that we envision for ourselves? Is this something that will happen? Or is there some legitimacy to this pessimism? Or can there be some optimism in this conversation?
I'll just talk about how I learned what to expect out of racial progress. Because my next film is going to be about critical race theory, I have been reading a lot of critical race theory and reading specifically Derek Bell. Raise your hand if you've read Derek Bell. Cool. So he's great. He has this, he's basically was the founder of this ideology, and he's asking a question. Critical race theory grows out of the 1970s when he's asking this question: why do we teach the civil rights movement as a victory? Right? Like, as you were describing that timeline, I could see it so clearly because I was an educator for a little while too, right? And it's like, yes, it's Rosa Parks and King and X, and we've already done the Washington versus Du Bois thing, and then maybe we have a couple of astronauts, and then it's Obama, right? And then we end the story with, and look to your left and look to your right, that was King's dream. And Bell in the 70s is asking, guys, integration didn't even work, right? Like, he's like, you see it? Back to Dr. Banjo's comment, like, you see it? Look at all of these schools that are still deeply segregated just because of white flight. Like, we didn't design the law correctly. We didn't design the law around remedy. We designed the law around the perpetrator's perspective, which is just like, don't do bad stuff anymore. don't discriminate, but nothing around remedy, right? And so he's trying to bring up this idea about, guys, I think there's a giant hole in the way we've designed law, because the civil rights movement, even though we want to celebrate it as this great victory, has these deep, deep failures that we don't even have language to talk about. And so I hadn't, until, I'm 36 now, been thinking about this concept of, I think we all learned about civil rights with the same timeline. I'm like, isn't it great? And if it was a movie, you would pan to the sky off of that sunny picture, that sunny saturated picture of the March on Washington. You'd pan up to the clouds, and then you'd come down to Barack Obama, and then you'd come out to the class, and it's an interracial class. So that is just to say, I think our whole notion of progress is built in this idea that it's inevitable, this idea that we've taught kids, and we are not teaching them about how Reconstruction was deeply dismantled by white supremacists and white apathy of politicians. We are not teaching them about how we integrated schools in 1874 in New Orleans, and white supremacists ripped those kids out of those schools. We do not teach students now, 37-year-old people now, that in every moment of great black freedom, we've had an equally intense moment of backlash. So that is all to say that I am still trying to break out of what I expect out of progress based on how we're trained. And then I'm also trying to remember that it doesn't necessarily mean that we are moving back when white supremacists attack the Capitol. I think it is a measure of the success that we are having, right? That like when white supremacists act up and attack governments and try to ban us talking about what they did, it is a measure that we are successful. In Richmond, last year passed the most progressive standards reforms that we've seen. Before last year, if you were a student in Virginia, you had to learn that the Civil War was caused by slavery and states' rights. Richmond changed it and is like, no, the whole state has to learn slavery. So that's dope. They also have a governor now who you bet is gonna undo that. So for me, I don't know about how to hope, I don't know how much progress there is, but I am feeling our power based on the backlash.
My first response, Alfred, and hopefully this isn't taken the wrong way, was, let's just go back to Africa. I got family in Nigeria if anybody who wants to join. Because I remember learning about, I see his hat, like because Marcus Garvey, and just thinking, that was not the right way, but I understand now. I understand, I actually do think it's profitable. I mean, in light of a lot of people, I forget the term now, going back to Africa, sort of becoming citizens of different African countries, repatriating something. Yeah. So I see this movement. I think for some people it's because they're tired. But to what CJ just talked about, and what I mentioned earlier about hegemonic negotiations, it's just going to be a constant tension because nobody wants to give up power. We're talking about race here. Let's not even talk about gender or class. Nobody wants to give up power, so there's constant tension. And I think the only way that we can sort of address that tension and try to make sure we still have a dog in the fight is through education and empowerment of people whose voices have been silenced, as well as people who are silent and can talk to their white supremacist friends maybe and do some of that work. And then also increasing ownership. I remember Will Smith said once in an interview that once African Americans or people of color get distribution power, it's on. It's just within the past 20 years or so that there's, maybe decade, just 10 years, that there's been an increase of ownership. And the more you get production ownership, then you can, I'm coming from a media perspective, then you can tell the stories you want to tell. You don't have to ask permission. Once you have that money, but Jay-Z and Will Smith had to come together to do that. To tell stories. And they're not the only ones, right? There are other people, whether Ava DuVernay or Issa Rae, Yvonne Orji, all these people who are trying to use their resources to tell stories that sort of challenge and push against, and not just talking about racism, but just humanizing Black people. Like, they're just in love. They're not like slaves and love, they're just people. And so the more we increase ownership, I think that will help to present a counter view. Another pessimistic response though, and this is probably a really bad joke, but one of the concerns is that in 2050, white people will be minority, and then another response is just have more babies, y'all.
I think my response is, and I've been trying to think about this, but it is, we will not overcome. You have bad soil, no matter what seeds you grow, they will die, right? It doesn't matter how much you water it, but if the soil, the foundation is not good, then there's no way that, in my opinion, that we can progress, even if we do create the black dollar and we get, generational wealth, will Black Wall Street happen again? So like that's kind of my perspective right now, and I think that the only solution to actually overcome is to address the actual issue and find a way to go back to our Constitution that controls our law, that controls the way we operate as a legal system, which controls the way police are allowed to patrol. And I think once we address that issue and start making changes there, then maybe we can have some type of progress.
I would love to say the historian in me, who is because I'm a historian, I am a pessimist because I've seen it, read about it, hundreds of years of systemic institutional, racism, of discrimination, of segregation, how it's codified in the laws, how it works in practice. I've seen it, read it, talked about it, and I am a pessimist. But then every now and again, something will happen that will give me just a sliver of hope. I don't know if you all have checked the headlines, but all three of the gentlemen who killed Ahmaud Arbery have been convicted of a federal hate crime. Like, that means something. The idea that we are now in a place, like, this is a big deal. The historian in me likes to see accountability. Like, that is what it's going to take. Consistent accountability, holding people responsible, holding communities responsible, holding governments responsible. Did you know, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but in 1921 when Tulsa burned, actually it was the Black Side of Time when Tulsa burned, did you know that it was estimated in today's dollars that, okay, I don't know if you know how deep this was, 35 square blocks of a black community were not just hunted off, picked off. The white sheriff deputized most of the white men, gave them guns, then sent them into the black side of town. Once he did that, private airplane owners, they firebombed Tulsa. That's 35 square blocks of black excellence. Hospitals, homes, churches, insurance companies. Today's estimated value lost, $200 million. $200 million. How many people in this room have had, a windfall from a grandfather or an uncle, somebody who could pass down a house that was sold in order to subsidize something? That's called generational wealth. And the federal government I firmly believe the federal government created the white middle class back in the 1940s with the GI Bill, but that's a whole different thing. But so there's got to be some type of accountability. And the fact that we're finally in a place where individuals are having to be accountable for their actions, I think that is a tiny sliver of progress, but I'm not going to put my whole foot in the water, just to tell.
To play the literal devil's advocate for a second. If I was a lawmaker and I wanted to be the most effective possible, I would pass a divisive concept law here, and you wouldn't be able to say any of the things you just said. Right? With one law, we've all agreed it's about education. How do we help students see models of resistance from the past? How do we help them see the cyclical nature of white supremacy? How do we help them see how white moderates have gotten in the way and failed to step up to their responsibility? How do we show them interracial coalition in Bacon's Rebellion rising up against the masters, right? Like, how do we show all this stuff? I could shut all of that down with one law that makes it impossible for you to talk about Tulsa because, oh God, that makes white kids feel uncomfortable. And makes it impossible for you to talk about Ahmaud Arbery or DuBose because, what, are you anti-police and we don't want these kids to become anti-police, right? Like, I just want to, if you are a fan of Marvel films, these divisive concept laws are like Thanos' glove. right? Why come for all the separate things when I can have one legal device that undoes it in a snap, that keeps us from being able to name the injustice of the past and name the injustice of the present legally? And you don't even need to get fired. You just need to be I just need to get one teacher, one professor fired in the state for them to have a chilling effect on you and the rest of your faculty friends who are like, dang, I don't want that to happen to me. I got kids I'm sending to college. I'm doing this stuff. So that is all to say, I feel hopeful. I feel powerful out of all the things, but I also feel terrified at how effective this Thanos glove has been and how little people seem to understand about what it is capable of and how fast it is spreading around the country, right? Louisiana today has a bill considering of their CRT ban, if it is effective, will mean that all history teaching has to be race neutral. So this is our plessy, and you know, my very direct question is like, what are all of us doing? Either the research that you were doing in classes, the things you are writing down, the ways that the university is standing for intellectual freedom. Like, what are the ways that we keep devil's advocate me from passing a law that stops you from saying all of those brilliant, empowering things?
Thank you. So whether you're a Black historian, whether you're a Black media scholar, a Black student leader, a Black comedian and television producer, in your film you mentioned this idea of earning your spot in the Black consciousness. Right? Yeah, it was something near the end where you talked about the film sort of allowed you to feel like you did that, like you accomplished that. Do you feel that having these positions in varying degrees of being in public are a responsibility, or that having these positions come with a responsibility, or do you feel as an obligation or a burden to be in a public space and Black? And having to tell these stories, or feeling the responsibility of telling these stories?
Sure, I'll answer just quick from my position of a comedian and filmmaker person. Yeah, I feel that pressure all the time. I think it's an opportunity, particularly with comedy, to find a back door to folks. But the place that I worry about it is like when the pony show becomes like a tight little show that people book, and they're like, see, we don't have a race problem because CJ came here and like said those things and we all had a moment together. So that's just the thing that I think about a lot. So I am trying to spend more time with young folks to do what Dr. Banjo was talking about being like, how do I make sure that any of my mental energy is being spent talking to like K through 12, essentially, about what resistance looks like and projects they can do on their own to like topple their own monuments, and video projects they can make challenging racial myth, and how much easier it is to make how documentary is essentially just a fancy TikTok that like kids are already making stuff like this. So yeah, I feel pressure to be Black and helpful all the time when I'm on a stage, and then I worry sometimes that people will mistake that speech for actual progress.
This is something that I struggle with as well. Sometimes others don't allow me to turn what I do off. And that is one of the things that I struggle with. Shameless plug. What we do in different spaces, I happen to be the new TAC professor in the public humanities. And it's a position that allows me to do a lot more public-facing work. One of the things that I've always had a problem with here at the university is that we seem to keep all of our resources and expertise to ourselves. The Queen City needs things that we could be doing as individuals, as scholars, as activists, as volunteers, but we keep those things to ourselves. So I'm really excited about being able to do the work that I do out in the public. And one of the things that I enjoy doing is taking history out there. And so I'm doing like little soft touches. And so this month I've been doing a 4-part speaker series down at Ludlow Wines. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it down in Clifton. But it has just been a really great open community space. Like every Wednesday, 6 p.m., Mike does heavy pours, and we go and have incredibly difficult conversations. We talk about the African diaspora and liberation. We talk about universities' wealth and slave benefactors. You know, we spent some time talking about the destruction of Black generational wealth, and then tomorrow night we're actually talking about race and film. And so it's just been really great to be able to get out and do those things, because you get to get the message to people who otherwise wouldn't have it or wouldn't be able to access it. But then at that same time, it marks you, right? It publicly marks you as, that's the one that has the Black talk, that does the Black thing, that does the Black fill in the blank. And it has happened that, like, I've been at social spaces, I'm trying to have a party, I'm trying to get turned, like, the bar is open, right? Like, let's do it. And then somebody pulls me aside and wants to talk to me about their feelings. I'm like, how can I be non-racist? Well, first, you can stop ruining my time at this party right now, because I'm trying to get down. But so, like, and so it is a struggle, but I love what I'm able to do, because it does, I know this sounds so cliche, but it really does feel like an honor. It really does when I can get in the classroom. Like, every semester I have at least one student who writes me an email or writes a card that says, this class did this class made me think about that. And it makes me feel like I know I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, even though I'm frustrated, even though I'm a pessimist sometimes. Those bright little shining stars, like, that is what makes it worth it for me, so.
I don't have the same conviction. I think I'm to the point, I'm 22, and I think that for me, like, experiencing freedom is kind of experience in life, and I can spend my time, right, trying to educate and continue to learn about these oppressive systems, or I can be 22 and go to the bar and have a good time, you know? And I think that I'm kind of to a point where, like, I feel like it's important for me, you know, as a Black man experiencing racial battle fatigue, to just experience life without all of the complicatedness, you know? And there is a time, right, where, like, I might have to check or educate or speak about things, you know, such as now, but I just don't want to dedicate my life to that type of oppressive system. I feel like, you know, we've, as minorities, enough has been taken from us, right? So for me, it's like, at least I can have the little bit of joy that I do have, you know, when I get to have it, so, yeah.
I'm glad you're choosing that. I think I unknowingly opted into doing this work all the time, because my area of research has centered Black narratives, and I've been very bold about it, because in grad school I was told, oh, you won't get grant money if you do that, you won't get tenure if you do that, study more mainstream things. And I don't know, it was the Yoruba arrogance in me. Yoruba is a tribe in Nigeria. My dad's very proud about it. He must have passed it on to me. Because my thought was, I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to validate these stories. And thank God I got tenure. I was able to do that. And then one of my most recent books, I didn't name these people, but I said thank you to all the people who told me not to study race in academia. So it's not just, you know, politicians who are regulating what gets talked about. Even in academia, there are people who say, you talk about these things, they're not threatening you, but you don't get a positive review. They ask you, well, what's the purpose of this question? Why do we have to study? So things like that at times can also silence you. And so I just have this thing in me where I'm like, I think Black people are beautiful, and I think we are worth talking about. And but I've gotten tired. So much to the point that I wrote this spoken word piece. I performed it here. Thank God I still have a job afterwards. Because the title of the poem was Confessions of a Tired Race Scholar. It was a long title. But in there I talk about dealing with racial battle fatigue, not just with academia, but also sometimes with your colleagues, and having to deal with institutions that say that they care about these issues, but then they obviously don't. It is really tiring. But then I had this conversation with Eduardo Bonilla Silva, for anyone who is familiar with him. He's a sociologist, Puerto Rican dude. And I told him, I said, I'm tired. And he said, that's okay. There's a time that's, take a step back, sit down, but who's gonna do the work? Who's gonna do it? So it's not for all of us to do, but I kind of chose it. So I know that there's a time for me to talk, and there's a time for me to stop. There's a time to heal, there's a time to fight. And so I'm trying to consider that. But another thing I wanted to point out, as I was listening to you, CJ, I was thinking about, yeah, if a bill passes, you know, we could lose our jobs. Let's plan on what we want to do afterwards. Start a business or something. But then I thought, and maybe I'm giving the media too much power, but that's the beauty of entertainment, though. I think that they can still be educators. Now, we're hyper-fragmented. So whether or not someone sees a movie or not, or a movie or a show or something like that, you never know. But there's still ways to get our messages out there through technology. And then I was thinking about the Hollywood 10, and I was like, I can't imagine in 20-anything that governments will say, are you talking about critical race theory in your films? Because that's what they did when they thought they were socialist. If that's where we're at, it's a scary time. So anyway, that's something I thought about in terms of maybe the potential power of digital technologies to sort of still get that information out there.